Hey everyone, I think we are live here. If for any reason someone can't hear me, let me know. And thank you everyone for joining us. I'm actually lucky enough to be joined right now by two of my good friends, Christoph, who's going to be, I guess, running this crazy adventure. Would you like to say hi, Christoph?
Hey everyone, how are you?
And Tia is joining us as well, but she is unfortunately not on camera right now. Tia, would you like to say hey?
Hey guys, hope everybody's doing well.
So I'm going a little bit slow today on these introductions just because I see the number kind of raising on viewers. So I know people are just kind of joining in a little bit late today. Um, for our future study groups, I'll continue to do the countdown for you guys to be able to join us at the 10-minute mark. And okay, so I think we've kind of given a little bit for people to click, but we'll go a little slow here. I just wanted to welcome everyone and say thanks for joining us for this AWS study group. I will be the first one to say that I have not had the pleasure of actually spending much time using AWS. I've been more of an OpenStack person. Christoph, have you had a lot of experience with AWS before deciding to lead us down this road?
Yes, definitely. So that's actually the first cloud service provider that I messed around with. And so at heart, I do have a slight preference for AWS compared to other platforms, just because that's where I learned how to use the cloud and really what the cloud was. So I've been working with years and actually used to train on it prior to this point, but I'll touch on that a little bit more. So yes, I do have quite a bit of experience running stuff on AWS.
So, Tia, I know you yourself have to get back to your busy day as a content author or a course architect now. Sorry. Or, no, actually, Tia, you have had so many titles now. There's a new one. I guess I'll just let you introduce yourself and what it is that you do.
Hey guys, so my my role for the Cloud Practitioner course is that I was the training architect for that course. I'm excited actually. I just was promoted. I'll be working kind of in a role where I'll get to help other training architects to build their courses. So I'm really excited about that. But I really just wanted to take an opportunity to welcome everybody to the study group. You guys are going to have a lot of fun as part of this. The course is designed so that it's written for anyone who has an interest in AWS. So there are no prerequisites at all. There's no, excessive tech speak. I try to explain everything in plain language and use analogies wherever possible to help convey some of those concepts that might be a little bit more complex. So you guys are going to really get the benefit of being able to learn AWS with the study group and with a great course. There's a lot of things in this course. You got hands-on labs. I know Christoph is going to do a great job helping you guys to get started in your AWS journey. And like I said, I do have to get back to some meetings for the day, but I did want to at least step in for a few moments just to say hello and to wish you guys good luck in your studies.
All right. Thanks, Tia. You have a great day. And I guess with that, that should be enough time for everyone to join us. So we'll go ahead and get this started. Now, Christoph, can you tell us a little bit about this actual certification? What is it that we're working towards?
Yeah, of course. The premise of what we're going to talk about today as well, which is kind of walking through what the AWS Cloud is like. So what is the format of the exam? How long do you have to take it? And all types of questions that honestly I get on a weekly basis because they're good questions. You want to know more about the exam before you go and spend money to take it, and you want to increase your odds of passing it. So it makes total sense. And then after that, once we walk through what the exam is like in the format and answer a lot of those questions, we're actually going to move on to talk about the cloud in general. So what is the cloud? How is the cloud different from on-premises? When did that transition happen? How did it happen? Things like that. And then we'll transition to also talking about Amazon Web Services specifically, since obviously this is an AWS specific certification exam. And we're going to talk about how AWS fits into that cloud model. So now that after we understand what the cloud is at a conceptual level, how does AWS fit into the cloud model? And what does that look like? So those are really the three or four main things that we're going to cover in this kickoff for the first study. And then after that, we'll talk a little bit more about the future study groups that we're going to be running and how we'll go into more depth towards what AWS is and really getting prepped to pass that certification exam.
Yeah, I'm gonna put you on the spot here because I didn't tell you I was gonna ask you this question. But one thing that people kept asking me is like, we're doing this study group for basically 2 months. Is that really realistically enough time for someone to go from like myself, hey, I know AWS exists, but I haven't really used the platform to getting certified?
It is, and this is also a question I get all the time. So thank you for bringing that up. I didn't even think about it. But the thing is, I've personally seen so many different people go through these types of certification exams, and some of them can pass it in just a matter of a couple of weeks. Others, it takes longer. And there's a lot of different factors that go around that. So I can't give you a black and white answer. But the main factors that go into it are number one, your experience level. How much experience do you have with the cloud? How much experience do you have with AWS or IT in general? And also, how much time do you have to dedicate to studying, right? Is it an
Mm-hmm.
hour a week? Is it 10 hours a week? It totally depends on how much time you have, because if you only have a couple hours a week to study, then obviously it's going to take you a longer period of time to feel confident enough to go and pass the certification exam. So really looking at all those different factors, you can try to estimate how long it will take you to pass the exam. But there is no black and white answer. You really have to look at your experience and your studying schedule that you have available to you.
All right. Well, with that, I know that you've prepared some information for us to get our journey started. So I'll go ahead and give it to you to, I guess, kick us
Awesome.
off.
Sounds good. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. And Elle, please let me know when you are able to see the slideshow.
All right. We're looking good.
Perfect. So just to give a little bit of context before I do move forward, we have about an hour scheduled. Really, I'm going to try to finish in about 30 minutes, but also I want to interweave conversations in between here. So I don't want this to just be about half an hour. I want this to be interactive. So please, if you have any questions, pop them into the Twitch live stream chat. Go ahead and ask them, and then we'll be able to turn those into questions on the live stream here and answer that live. And that way it'll make the study group a lot more interactive. But also, this is what this is meant to do. I'm here to help fill in gaps. I'm here to help answer questions about concepts or practicality of AWS. But the way that I can do that the best way is for you to ask me questions about things that are complicated or you need more information on, because we're going to have a lot of different skill levels in this group, and it's totally okay for you to be completely new. In fact, I know that's your mantra, L, which is it's okay to be new. We really truly believe in that. There are no stupid questions here. This is a safe environment. So please ask your questions.
Hey, Christoph, can we do a quick audio check? Because I seem to be having some audio. Okay. Guys, give us a quick moment and we're going to troubleshoot some audio. We'll be right back with you guys.
Hey, can you hear me now? Could you hear me? Did it stop working when I shared my screen? Oh, weird. All right. Can Twitch hear me now? Okay, great. Let me go ahead and share my screen again. And when did you lose me, or when did I cut out?
All right, guys, sorry about that. We are back. And all right, I think the last thing we heard was you telling us to feel free to ask all the questions.
Awesome. That's a great point for it to drop. But the rest of what I was going to say is that this even though I'm here to help you pass the certification exam, what we're going to cover in the 4 or 5 sessions that we have for the study group, they're not going to be sufficient, right? You're going to have to take some time outside of the study group to really continue to learn a lot of the concepts that we're walking through and to fill in some of the gaps, just because we're not going to have enough time to really go through it all. So I'm here to do my best in helping you get ready for it. But at the end of the day, you will have to complete some quote unquote homework. You will have to do some extra research outside of this. And then as you do that, bring that to the study group, the next sessions that we have, and ask your questions. Even if it's not in my agenda to cover, if you have that question, we can certainly look at it. So again, just wanted to tie those loose ends there and say, this is a safe place to ask those questions. And with that, I'm ready to get started as long as everybody can still hear me.
We're still good.
Fantastic. Okay. So before I go on and talk about the exam, let me talk a little bit about myself. Elle, you asked me earlier if I have some AWS experience, and I've been working at AWS for quite a few years now, running production workloads. And also, I used to be an AWS instructor at the Linux Academy when I first joined the company about 3.5 years ago. So at that point in time, I created deep dive courses, like an AWS deep dive course, a course on backups and databases, and also certification-based courses. So I taught 3 different AWS certifications, including associate and professional level certifications. And currently, I've got a couple that are going to expire if I don't get them recertified. But I do still have the developer associate, the DevOps engineer professional certification, and of course the cloud practitioner, which we're going to cover today. So I've been able, thousands of people get AWS certified, and I'm hoping that all of you will be able to join that group as well. And outside of about me, Linux Academy's actually trained hundreds of thousands of people, and it's been a really humbling experience to be able to say, I've helped you change your career, I've helped you pass the certification, and it's super humbling. In addition to that, we're currently training about 12,000 plus Amazon employees who have created accounts on our platform and that use Linux Academy to train for different topics like AWS, DevOps, Linux, security. And in total, we have about 9 categories right now. So we really cover a lot of different areas. But in this, of course, we'll be focusing on the AWS Cloud Practitioner. So that's about me, and that's about Linux Academy. And with that, let's just dive right in, get feet first into the AWS Cloud Practitioner. So before we started this study group, I had a few people reach out to me and they said, in the description of the study group, you say that this is even for beginners, even if you have no IT experience. But is that really true, right? Is this an exam that's right for me? Even if I come from no background, or on the flip side of that, I have a lot of technical knowledge. Should I spend time on the Cloud Practitioner exam, or is there a better exam for me to take? And again, it's not a black and white answer. I wish I could give you a black and white answer, but what I wanted to do here is walk through briefly some of the domains that are covered by the exam. I know this looks like a long list, but this is the official list of domains, from AWS as to what the Cloud Practitioner exam covers. And this is a really good starting point to understand whether you have the right skill set or whether you are too advanced. For example, with domain number 1, you have the cloud concepts. So define the AWS cloud and its value proposition, identify aspects of AWS cloud economics, list the different cloud architecture design principles, and then you have these other 3 domains that list other kinds of competencies. And so this is a great list to kind of walk through and read and keep in the back of your head. But instead of trying to deconstruct some of the very high level language that they use in these domains, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to switch over to our Cloud Practitioner course syllabus that Tia put together because it helps give you structure. Now, what I'll say about this is you don't have to be a Linux Academy member for this study group. You don't have to have an account. You don't have to do any of this. But the reason that I'm pulling up the syllabus is because even if you don't take this course, it will be very helpful in giving you structure to study for the exam because it breaks it down and matches those domains. Tia put a lot of time and effort into looking at the exam itself and the domains in the exam, and then building that syllabus to match those domains to best prepare you for the exam. So again, if you need that structure to understand how to cover all those domains, just scroll through this URL, the syllabus, and I'll have the URL in the show notes or the meetup.com notes so you can easily access them. Don't worry if you don't have the link yet. But scroll through this, take a look at the concepts covered. And also in the study group, we will be closely following this syllabus so that you can kind of match back and fill in some of the gaps to cover during the study group. So this is a great starting point to get that structure, to understand. and what the exam covers, and that can really help you better prepare than simply looking at these domains, but the domains are also very helpful in understanding. Again, answering the question of, is this exam right for you? Well, a lot of times when I get asked that question, I ask 3 different questions. And one of those is, why do you want this certification? Is it to help get a promotion? Is it to help with having conversations to potential customers, like prospects or existing customers, or even coworkers, like if you work in sales, for example, or marketing? Or is it to help you transition into the cloud and IT industry? Those are 3 really good use cases where I'd say that, yes, this is a good certification for you, especially if you're in sales, marketing, finance, if you're an executive, and you need to understand how AWS works at a conceptual level and still have some technical understanding of how to service your customers or how to talk to your customers in a way that that makes you sound like you really know what you're talking about at the end of the day. This is also a great stepping stone.
Oh no, this is going to be, I guess, the fun part of this. Give us one more second, guy, with the fun audio.
How is it now?
Yeah, we're good. We're gonna have to start doing giveaways to keep people happy with what's going on. We'll start doing some giveaways.
I gotta tell you, in 2019, I really didn't think that streaming would be this hard, but it is. It still is a pretty significant challenge. So if anybody has any ideas about how to solve problems for streaming, it's a good plan.
All right, continue, please.
Do you know where I got cut off?
Maybe somebody could give us some info on that. But the last thing that I heard was you're going over the, why do you want this certification? And I think we pretty much covered this slide.
Okay, perfect. So if you're listening to this and maybe you don't think it's the right solution for you because 1, it's too advanced, or 2, it's not advanced enough, these are a couple of other options I'd recommend that you check out. You can also check these out as a supplement to the Cloud Practitioner. Like the AWS Essentials covers a lot of the same topics, but it'll go deeper into certain services that are outside of the scope of the certification exam. So that can give you broader exposure. And then the AWS Certified Solutions Architect Associate Level exam, that one is definitely more advanced at the technical level. So if you feel like this one's going to be a little bit too easy for your skill level, I would recommend checking that one out and seeing if that's a better starting point for you. Okay, with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit more about what the exam itself looks like. So if you go and sit for the AWS Cloud Practitioner exam, you can expect to have multiple choice and multiple answers as the solution when you're going through the different questions, and you're going to have about 65 questions. So what that looks like is, on the right-hand side, I've got a screenshot from the official AWS sample questions, and I'll show you how to find those. They're very helpful. But that's what the exam actually looks like. You've got the question, then you have A, B, C, and D, and you either have to select one correct answer, or you can sometimes select up to 2 different correct answers, and they'll tell you, select 2 or just select 1, and that way okay, I need to look for 2 different answers, or I just need to look for 1 answer. And with this, the biggest tip I can give you is always look for the best solution to the answer. And sometimes AWS will try to sneak in some trick wording in there that completely changes the answer. For example, when I took the exam, there was a word that they snuck in there that I almost ran over with my eyes because I was reading it really quickly and I thought, great, this is an easy question, easy answer. I selected the answer. It's like, I'll double check just to make sure. I read it again. I saw that trick wording in there, and that completely changed the answer. So I would have gotten it wrong if I hadn't modified it. So just look out for some of those trick questions and trick answers that they have in there. The exam time is up to 90 minutes. So when you start the clock, you have 90 minutes to complete it, which makes it more than 1 minute per question, which if you're really prepared for the exam should be plenty of time. You won't feel too rushed going through it. There's a $100 per attempt cost. So if you take it 3 times, you'll have to pay $300, $100 each time. And there is no limit on the number of attempts. So if you fail it 3 times in a row, that's totally fine. Take it a fourth time. You can take it however many times you need in order to pass the exam. So don't feel too pressured. It's okay. You can always try later. You can try every 14 days, I believe. So that's out of the way there. Elle, are there any questions in the chat about the exam format or anything before we move on to talking more about the cloud and what AWS is?
No, I think you've done a great job of explaining everything.
Awesome. I've also got, I'll keep saying this and I'll show you how to access it, but I've got a list of URLs you can access. And one of those URLs is going to point you to where to find more information about the exam from AWS themselves. And that way you can get the information to reference back if you do end up forgetting. And that makes it easy. But moving on, what we're going to start with is demystifying the cloud. So what is the cloud? And don't worry if you already know what the cloud is, or if you think you know what the cloud is, we won't spend too much time on this. We'll move on pretty quickly to talking about AWS, but I did want to cover it in case you don't know necessarily what the cloud is, or you have a certain mental model, and we're talking about a different mental model. So Elle, when I say what is the cloud, what does the cloud mean to you?
I have been so prepared for this question my entire career, so I'm ready. The
Awesome.
cloud is a bunch of other people's computers pulled together to make one resource that we can then just treat as a single resource, regardless of how many little parts of it it's composed of. Will that work?
That answer was way too polished. I promise we did not practice. I promise we did not practice that. Apparently, you've been practicing it, but
yes,
that was not part of the plan. So nice, awesome. So I pulled this picture from the web, and it's a company called Imagix. And they process images for you on the fly and things like that. But what's important here is when you look at this server room, back in the day, before the cloud term was really coined, if you needed to host an application, meaning a website or anything like a mobile application or something like that, you typically had to pay somebody to host the servers for you, or you had to buy the hardware yourself and go in a data center, lease the space, or even buy a data center and put your hardware in there and manage that hardware. Nowadays, that's changed quite a bit, but there are still companies that are using their own, what we call on-premises resources. Like this company here, they actually still run their own servers and own hardware in a data center somewhere. So the model hasn't completely gone away, and there are pros and cons that we're going to cover those. But I wanted to make that a clear distinction of that used to be one of the only options you had for organizations or individuals. But now with the quote unquote cloud, that's changed drastically. And one of the reasons that the cloud developed is because the on premises model of you having your own hardware had a lot of different challenges, especially business challenges. Number one, cost control, capital expenditures for equipment purchases. You have to spend a lot of money up front for purchasing that hardware to put it in the data center, which means you also have to plan for future growth. So if I'm saying, if I'm the head of IT and I need to budget out for the next few years, and I know that I have a certain workload today, but in a couple of years it's going to triple, I need to buy the hardware for that tripling now, because otherwise it won't be ready for the future, which means I have huge CapEx expenditures up front, which also means I'm less flexible because I can't allocate that capital anywhere else in the business. And the hardware is just going to sit there unused, so it's not a good capital spend a lot of the times. Another problem is distributed workforce. More and more, we're hearing about companies that have remote workers. And so if you have on-premises resources, but you have somebody else that's across the world, how do you give them access to those resources? Well, you have to open it up, which introduces other security issues. So that's another problem. And then the third one I put on here, although these are definitely not the only three issues, is slow provisioning. Kind of like what I was talking about earlier. You have to purchase the equipment, you have to test it, make sure it works, you have to set it up, you have to update, patch, and you have to constantly maintain security. Especially if you own the data center or the hardware in it, you have to go in, you have to make sure that people can't access it physically, steal hard drives, steal data, and things like that. So there are really big challenges with the on-premises model that the cloud is going to drastically change, or has been drastically changed, I should say. So those are three of the main challenges. The reason I asked Elle what her mental model of the cloud is because it totally depends on who you ask. For example, I was in a Lyft drive to the airport the other day, and somebody asked me, "What do you do?" And I say, "Well, I work for a company at Linux Academy. We train people on how to use the cloud." And she seemed very confused because one, she thought that most organizations were already using the cloud, or she thought that in a lot of cases they didn't really need to build their own stuff in the cloud because so many services already exist, like Office 365, Dropbox, Salesforce, Zoom, just to name 3 or 4 out of probably millions at this point. And so each person has a different mental model. And then, of course, you also have AWS and other cloud providers, which is what I usually think of when I think of the cloud. So, what is the cloud? Well, again, talking about the on premises solution, you had a lot of issues with that, or you still have a lot of issues with that. And so, a lot of people, a lot of entrepreneurs and companies found opportunity in those challenges and then came along 3 different types that we'll categorize in this what is the cloud. The first one is called infrastructure as a service. I would recommend that you probably memorize these terms just because they're pretty important in the cloud space. Um, and that way you can talk about what is IaaS or PaaS or SaaS services, right? You've probably heard the word SaaS quite a lot. You may have not heard of the other ones that much. But essentially, software as a service, as you know, the entire infrastructure, operating system, and software is provided by a third party. For example, Zoom. You download a client, you set up an account, you're good to go. Dropbox, same thing. You create an account, you download software, you don't have to modify the software, you upload your files to it, and you're good to go. You don't have to do anything else. On the infrastructure as a service side, however, is very different because only part or all of an infrastructure is provided by a third party. So that's where something like AWS comes into play, especially the service EC2 or Elastic Cloud Compute, which we'll talk about quite a bit more. So don't freak out if you don't know what that is. We'll definitely go into a lot of depth in a future study group. We also have companies like Rackspace that you've probably heard of and DigitalOcean. These would be considered infrastructure as a service because they are able to offer you that infrastructure and you build on top of it. Platform as a service, on the other hand, will offer you that entire infrastructure already pre-built and operating systems that are provided by that third party. A service that comes to mind for that is Heroku. I don't know if you've ever heard of it or not, but you could check it out and see. And there's also AWS Elastic Beanstalk, which is another service offered by AWS, where you basically just create your application, you throw that code over the fence to the infrastructure, and it just runs, right? It just works out of the box. You don't have to configure anything else, which is quite magical and also very different from infrastructure as a service and software as a service. If you don't fully understand what I'm talking about here, don't worry about it. Don't let it overwhelm you. Just keep in the back of your head the different models like SaaS, PaaS, and IaaS, as they are often referred to. The other interesting thing that I'll mention real quick is that you see the AWS in multiple of these, like infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and I could have even put it under software as a service because AWS can tick all of those different boxes. And this will make more sense as we move along in the study groups. And it's quite interesting as how that works. Before I move on, since I did cover quite a bit of information about these different services here, are there any questions about these? And again, don't worry if this totally goes over your head. I just wanted to give a brief overview, but it'll make more sense as we move on to the next slide as well. So any questions regarding this?
If y'all guys have any questions, please go ahead and put them in through our Twitch chat. But I do love that the answer to what is the cloud that was most prevalent in chat is someone else's infrastructure.
Yeah.
So I think that's
someone
awesome.
else's infrastructure.
Yep.
So
right.
Awesome.
Oh, I was going to say that everybody seems that we're going awesome so far, so we can keep going.
Okay, great. I'm glad my audio has not cut out again. That's fantastic. Okay, so we just talked about it at a conceptual level, but I'm a graphical person. You have to show me pictures for me to truly understand it. And so I pulled this from hostingadvice.com. It's a great graphic that shows what I was just talking about. The first thing we covered is on premises on the left-hand side. You manage all of those different layers. Now, if you read those layers, you have no idea what they mean, don't worry about it. What's important to know about this graphic is each of those layers, like networking, storage, servers, etc., all of those have their own complexity. So each layer that you add on top of one another, you increase complexity that you or your staff has to deal with. So the more of those layers you don't have to manage, technically or theoretically, there should be less of that hardship that you have to manage because there's a lot less that could go wrong that you have to manage yourself. So again, on the on-premises side, you manage all of it. You own the hardware, you own everything, and you have to put it together. Adds a lot of complexity. The infrastructure as a service that we just talked about removes roughly half of those layers, where that third party manages the bottom half, and then you manage the operating system and everything on top of it. Then platform as a service even fewer things that you have to manage. Again, that's that AWS Elastic Beanstalk service. You have an application, you have data, you throw that application and data over the fence, and the third party makes it work. It's like magic. And then, of course, the software as a service, you remove all of those different layers. You sign up for an account and you have immediate access to that service, usually for a fee that's going to be a monthly or yearly fee. So this kind of helps me put it into perspective as to what the differences are. And also you can start seeing that trend of on-premises has a lot of complexity, a lot of upfront costs. The other tiers start to remove a lot of those costs and complexity. So we talked about what is the cloud. We showed that graphic, but now we need to consider 3 different cloud types. And then at the end, we'll ask what type of cloud is AWS. So when we think of the on-premises model that we just talked about quite a bit, that's going to be what we call the private cloud. It's your company's or your individual private cloud. It's the on-premises. You control all of those layers. And the benefits of that is it's fully customizable. You choose exactly what you want down to the hardware, down to the software, down to the security. You control that physical security and everything else that comes with it. The cons of that are lack of elasticity, and we'll talk about elasticity quite a bit. It's a very important concept for the exam. High overhead, you have to have more staff, high capital costs, you have to spend a lot more upfront, and potentially higher latency. We'll also talk about what latency means, as that is another important concept for the exam, so we'll cover that later. Then on the far right side, you have the public cloud itself. No on-premises resources, none that you have to manage yourself, right? Somebody else's infrastructure, as you were saying from the chat. The pros of that, there are quite a few. Some of the main ones I'm listing are there are no upfront capital costs, which means you pay as you go. That could be an hourly fee, a fee per 60 seconds, so per minute, or you could also purchase things upfront if you want for steeper discounts, but you pay as you go. You don't have to pay upfront. That also means higher elasticity and infinite scalability, or theoretically infinite scalability. Those 2 words, I'm going to keep talking about them until we explain them, and then beyond that as well, because they're very important terms. And typically, you'll get a lot lower overhead. The cons of the public cloud is you have less control over the hardware. You have less control over physical security, which I can sometimes see as a pro, but that could technically also be a con. And there could be governance issues. We see this a lot with things like healthcare companies, although that's starting to be less and less of an issue because they're building more and more infrastructure to bypass that. So we have private cloud and public cloud. If you mix the 2 together, that's what you get in the middle, which is the hybrid cloud. That's the combination of public and private clouds. The pros of this is it adds more flexibility than just a private cloud, or in some cases, just a public cloud, especially if you have things like governance issues, or if you have an on-premises application that you need to transition over, and that's going to take potentially years to do that. You can have that hybrid model where you start the transition, you use the public cloud to transition things off of the private cloud, and you can do that over the period of years. You can also use that for backup and what we'll call disaster recovery, which is another term that you'll be seeing more of. So with all of that information, quick pop quiz, what type of cloud is AWS based on everything that we've just talked about? Is it private? Is it public? Is it hybrid? Or is it 2 different ones?
All right, we've got someone screaming in all caps into chat that it's public. Are they right? Are they right? Oh, no, we're getting more publics coming in. And we actually did have a question come through, and
Okay.
somebody wanted a little bit of clarification of, does AWS offer PaaS, SaaS, and other offerings outside of the public cloud offering?
They do. They do have some. I would say that's something that we'll cover a little bit more, especially because. So actually, let me answer which one's correct, because that's also going to answer that. Which is, yes, it is the public cloud, but you can use AWS for hybrid cloud, meaning that if you have on-premises resources, you need to migrate things over to AWS. AWS does offer some different services that will help with that transition, and they even have certain things where you can have hardware delivered to your on-premises in order to help with that transition. So the answer is yes, they do have services, and they also have hardware that lets you have on-prem in order to eventually get it to the public cloud. So it really helps with that hybrid architecture. Hopefully that answers that question.
I think you did great there.
Perfect. And of course, we'll talk more about those services because that is something you might see on the Cloud Practitioner exam, a little bit of, to understand what services can help with that and what are the pros and cons of those. Okay. Unless there are other questions, I'm going to move on to what I think gets really excited, which is talking a lot more about AWS specifically and molding that into how that fits into the cloud model. So, we've talked about the cloud at a higher level, what that looks like, some benefits, some downsides of on premises versus cloud. But what is AWS? What is AWS made of? When we say somebody else's infrastructure, what does that truly mean? So if we look at the AWS global infrastructure, I'm going to point out four different key terms that you should absolutely remember and make sure that you understand. So make sure you jot those down. And of course, these slides will be available for download as well. So if you want to wait for those, that's totally fine. But I highly recommend that you jot these down. First one is going to be data centers. Wait a minute. On premises, I thought that was on premises. What about hardware? You still have to have that hardware. It's just, again, somebody else is managing it for you. So AWS has a bunch of different data centers all throughout the world, as you can see on the right hand side. And those are secure facilities where the AWS equipment is stored and managed by Amazon Web Services. You never have to visit it. You never have to touch it personally. It's all through an interface, so you don't have any of that complexity. Think back to that graphic we were just talking about. Those data centers are in what they call regions. These regions are geographically separated locations around the world, and those regions are made up of multiple availability zones. So each region has at least two or more availability zones for what we call fault tolerance and redundancy, two very important terms that we'll cover in more depth. And all of those availability zones are connected via very low latency networks. So think of them as clusters. Those availability zones, again, are made up of data centers and they make up a region. Then we also have edge locations. Those edge locations help deliver content closer to where users are for lower latency. And they form the backbone of the infrastructure for a service called Amazon CloudFront, which we'll talk quite a bit more about. For now, don't worry too much about the edge locations. It is important, but we'll cover it into a lot more depth. What you really need to focus on right now is availability zones and regions and understanding that they house data centers. And on that note, let me pull up this really cool thing that AWS created. And it's this map that I screenshotted. Pulling up this map, you can actually see what it looks like around the world. And for some reason, I don't have my mouse. I can't see it, so it's going to be really hard to guide it, but let's see if I can do it here. So if I zoom in on this map, you'll see all of the, oh, there's my mouse. You'll see all of these different clusters. You see Ohio, North Virginia, Canada, Oregon, North California, all across the world. These blue dots are the availability zones that make up this North Virginia region. So the region again is North Virginia. The cluster of blue dots is different availability zones. And within those availability zones, you have data centers where, think back to that image with ImageX, those servers that run on top of each other, that's where you would find those. But again, you never have to visit those. You never have to do anything directly with them. Instead, it's abstracted away from you. And then the pink dots are the edge locations, which are further away from the data centers, and that way it's closer to the end user. Again, we'll talk a lot more about that in the future. But I thought this map was really, really cool, and you can access it by going to infrastructure.aws, and you can kind of play around with that. And since I'm a visual learner, it really helps me remember the concepts. Let me go back to the slide real quick. Are there any questions about the differences between availability zones, regions, how data centers?
I think we might just have had the perfect moment for audio to drop because
Oh
no, yeah, we're there. Okay, so I actually am going to come back on camera for a second, and I'm going to ask you to ask them a question because I actually have some awesome little Pinehead AWS stickers to give away for the first person who's answered questions in our chat. So I've already given one away. So Christoph, can you come up with a question to ask them so someone can win one of these nifty stickers?
What's amazing is it totally looks like we rehearsed this, even though we didn't, because I have a pop quiz immediately after this. So that's such good timing. Thank
Great
you for
minds
that.
think alike.
So, pop quiz. What do you call data centers that are connected via low latency networks? Is it A, regions, B, data center, C, edge locations, D, availability zones?
Oh, we're getting some different answers here. So
Good.
the big says edge locations, and Castro 76. I hope I said that name right. Says availability zones.
So the correct, and those are two really good choices, and I know why you picked the edge locations. The answer to this is going to be availability zones because those data centers are built into those clusters and connected via low latency networks. That way, if one of those availability zones goes down and you've built the infrastructure with correct architectural principles, which we'll cover, then another availability zone will kick in and you won't lose any of that traffic, or the system will still be working. The edge locations do also provide that, but in this case, just because of how the question is worded, I would lean more towards the availability zones. But you're absolutely right in the sense that edge locations will also provide endpoints that are closer to the end users, and those are also connected via low latency networks. But just because I'm phrasing it the way like that with data centers and connected via low latency networks, if you see something like that on the Cloud Practitioner exam, I would probably lean more towards the availability zones, if that makes sense.
No, that does. And you know what? This is actually a little bit of an upset because most of the people answering in chat were guessing it's that edge location. I think this is one of those interesting things about, I don't want to say standardized tests, but about certification tests is it's all about the way that the question is worded and not just those keywords.
Absolutely. But both are really good choices there. I
All
think
right.
I have another one, or it might be later. Let me see. Oh no, it's later. Okay,
Okay. We'll hold the giveaways off.
I've got some more pop quizzes. Let's see if you can guess them, Elle.
Oh, no.
Okay, so now that we've covered some of the AWS global infrastructure and talked about different data centers, availability zones, and things like that, a lot of times that begs the question of who is responsible for what. So that's where the AWS shared responsibility comes in. And to answer that question, think about it this way. AWS themselves are responsible for security of the cloud, such as physical security and things like data decommissioning. So if you have data stored in AWS and you delete that data, you can trust that AWS will take the proper precautions, I can't speak, precautions to delete or to completely damage that hard beyond any point that anybody could find that data or decrypt that data or whatever else. So that's what they're responsible for, security of the cloud. On the other hand, you're responsible for pretty much everything else, which is what they call security in the cloud. Things like patching software, properly configuring and securing resources like S3, EC2 databases, and everything else, and also data encryption on the client side, but also enabling it on the backend or your server side, if you want to call it that. So this is important to understand because you might see questions like this on the exam, just because a lot of times you'll hear in the news like so and so's company had data stored in S3, that data was leaked, that data was not encrypted. There's two problems with that. First, the data wasn't encrypted. Second, that the data leaked in the first place and that the proper security permissions weren't set up. But you can't go to AWS and say this was your fault if it was a configuration issue, which the majority of the time it is. Now, if somebody broke into a data center and stole some hard drives that were backing Amazon S3 and they get access to your data, that would be the fault of AWS. So that's why it's important to understand the differences and where that kind of kicks in, just because that way you're better prepared to secure your AWS resources and environments. Any questions so far about the shared responsibility model?
Nope, I think we're doing good on not having questions. However, I think you hit a little too close to home for some folks with the recent Capital One breach there.
Oh yeah. Well, hey, it happens all the time. Like, not singling out Capital One or anybody. It honestly probably happens every other month. Like you pull up the news and it's happened. And those are just high profile cases. Think of all the non high profile cases or the ones that they haven't even realized. Like some companies might have already had their data leaked. They just have no idea it happened. So not singling anybody out, just mentioning a popular occurrence. And I have another pop quiz. So, who is responsible for properly discarding of hard drives storing your customers' data?
Let's see. All right.
Actually,
Adam
already answered
says
that one.
B. Amazon Web Services.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I just realized I answered that one in the previous, probably because I knew this was coming. But yeah, that's right.
There you go. Yay. All
Second
right.
question. Who's responsible for securing access to your AWS account and resources? Is it your organization? Is it Amazon Web Services? Is it the consulting partner that configured your account and resources that you hired on your behalf? Or is it a shared responsibility?
All right. Everybody's saying is it's your. Okay. Well, the first answer was AWS, but after that, the secondary answer has been A, your organization. Oh,
And
I'm
the answer
seeing.
is
I was gonna say I'm
So,
seeing a bunch of different ones, so this one might be a little split here.
good, good. I love it when that happens.
All right, so what's the final answer?
Did anybody pick C?
Let's. Oh goodness. All right, hold on. We've got nope. C is the only one that hasn't come. Oh well, now somebody's saying it.
No, so for some reason I thought somebody would say C just because they'd pull a like there's a contractual agreement or something. But no, contracts aside, in this case, who's responsible for securing access to your AWS account and resources is going to be your organization. Because in this case, when we say AWS resources, we mean things like the servers that you're running, the software you're running, the data in there, not the hardware or physical resources. So if you see this question, think about the software, the services that you log into and access through AWS. And in that case, you have to secure your own account. If somebody hijacks your account, it's not going to be AWS's fault if your password was too weak or if you didn't have the proper password rotations. It's going to be on you because you should have followed the proper protocols in order to secure your account and resources. So the answer is A. I love seeing multiple different answers, though. I wonder if did somebody pick D as well?
I only saw one or two D's coming through. A was the prevalent answer, but the I guess the gut instinct that we saw right away was AWS or B.
Yeah, and hopefully I explained it decently well of why that's not the case because it's not going to be at the physical level. It's going to be beyond that. Now, if somebody did break into the data center again, or if there was a vulnerability in the hardware that made somebody able to access your account, that would be a different story. But that gets pretty technical, and again, that very rarely happens in the grand scheme of things compared to the alternative. That is okay. I think I've got some more quizzes coming up, which they're pretty fun. So I'm excited about that. But before we get there, there are some key terms that you have to understand and honestly probably memorize, but more importantly, understand what they are and their differences. And the cool thing is, these also tie into cloud benefits. So we've talked a lot about some of the benefits like cost and things like that, but this is where it really starts to come into practice. The first term we're going to talk about is scalability. You probably hear this all the time about companies, tech startups, things like that. But in the case of AWS scalability, it means being able to grow in size, capacity, or even scope whenever that is needed. So if you have 1,000 users using your service today, tomorrow you're going to have 2,000, and the third day you're going to have 6,000 users. Scaling to that size is what we're talking about now. With AWS, you could do this on demand, literally within seconds or minutes, instead of having to provision years ahead of time, like we were talking about before. I don't necessarily have to think about next year or the year after that, although that's probably good practice. But even if I get it wrong, AWS will let me spin things up so quickly that can scale to that demand again within seconds or even minutes or minutes. And that's a huge benefit that you usually do not get with on premises, at least not without having unused resources. Which brings me to my next point, elasticity. Elasticity is awesome because, like I was talking about, if you were on premises and you wanted to be able to scale, you would buy that hardware up front and you'd let it sit there until you needed to use it. With elasticity, we don't have to do that, which means we can get significant cost savings. So, with our prior example, if we have 1,000 users today, then 2,000 users tomorrow, I spin up two different servers or multiple different servers to service those users. But then the day after that, I go back down to 1,000 users. There's no reason to continue having that other server or cluster of servers running. Instead, I can tear those down within minutes and I don't have to pay for them anymore because we're with the pay as you go model, which is where elasticity comes from. Think about a rubber band. You scale it out and then you shrink it back in on demand whenever you need to, and you don't have to pay for those extra resources versus on premises, you would have to pay for those extra resources. So scalability, elasticity, two different things, but they also sometimes go hand in hand. The other two key terms that we're going to talk about today is high availability and fault tolerance. They are often used in the same sentences. It's kind of difficult to differentiate them, but they are two totally different terms. So with scalability and elasticity, we can actually achieve high availability. And with fault tolerance, we can also achieve high availability. And that's kind of why they're often used together. But essentially, what high availability means is systems being accessible when someone or something tries to access them. Then fault tolerance is the ability to withstand a certain amount of failure while still being functional. So on the right hand side, you have this image with computers connected to a router that's supposed to be connected to the internet. If you have one router, and I'm sure everybody in this call has experienced this at some point, the router goes down for whatever reason, you completely lose access to the internet. You can't watch your Netflix anymore. You're obviously frustrated. What's going on? Let's fix the router. And you're down for, say, an hour and you're super frustrated. That could also happen with Google, except you probably can't remember the last time that you went to google.com and it didn't load up because they spend a ton of resources and time in perfecting that and making sure it goes down extremely infrequently, although it still does go down sometimes. And so in this case, in this scenario, one of the things that we could do to avoid that dreaded scenario is to add multiple different routers. So here we have one router, but imagine if you had two routers or even three routers. And that first router that's being used and the other ones aren't being used, that first one that's being used stops working. If you have it properly set up, it could automatically fail over to the second router. And so your users don't even notice that the internet went down, or they only notice that it went down for a few seconds. It looks like a blip, something didn't load right, they refresh it, it loads, and it's fine. You still have access to the internet. That's what fault tolerance looks like. You no longer have a single point of failure, unlike in our image, and therefore the systems still work. And also, you could have that other router self-healing, meaning that while it's down, it tries to reboot or it does something automatically and it tries to be operational again. That could be called self-healing. That's also part of fault tolerance. And if you've got that built-in fault tolerance, inherently, you should also get that high availability, which again is systems being accessible when someone or something tries to access it. Just like with the Google or Facebook example, you go to google.com, you want it to load every single time. That's high availability. And they've been able to achieve that in huge part thanks to things like fault tolerance. So scalability, we have elasticity, we have high availability, and we have fault tolerance. Again, you'll have access to these slides, but these are very important key terms to remember and to understand how they fit into the AWS model. So before I move on, which we're getting close to the end, how many questions, or do you have any questions about these different topics so far?
So far, I think everybody has been good, except for now everybody wants a sticker. So you're going to have to give them at least one more opportunity for that. But, oh.
You're so good at this. I love it. Which of these are benefits of the AWS cloud versus on-premises? And you need to select two. A, AWS removes IT costs. B, you're able to scale in minutes versus days. C, you can completely customize the servers without having to always manage them. Or D, you can lower upfront IT costs.
So first answer was given was D, then somebody followed up with A, then now we're having people going 1 and 2, and then followed by B, so every answer has been given. They're hedging their bets.
I love it. Smart. We have a smart group. Okay, the answer is, drumroll.
Oh, we need sound effects next time.
I know. B and D. You're able to scale in minutes versus days, and you lower your upfront IT costs. The reason why it's not A, although that does sound like an attractive option, is because technically AWS doesn't remove your IT costs. You're still going to have to pay as you go so that the cost isn't going to completely disappear. But more often than not, you're going to have a much, much lower upfront costs because of that pay as you go model. Now, there are also services we'll explore where you can pay upfront costs, but that will give you discounts to an otherwise pay as you go model. So both options are available versus on premises. Oftentimes you have to pay a lot up front. You don't have those options. So it's not completely removing it. It is lowering it. And then did anybody say C?
We had a few C's.
So the reason that C would not be correct in this case is, and I might use this sometimes interchangeably. I think a lot of people in the industry do, and I can totally understand why that gets confusing. But when I'm talking about servers, and I know I've mentioned the term a few times already, what I'm talking about is what we'll refer to as Amazon EC2. So I'm not controlling the hardware itself. Therefore, I can't completely customize it. Now, AWS offers a tremendous number of resources and hardware that you can build your applications off of, but technically they still only offer a limited set of resources, of hardware resources that you have to build on top of. You can't completely customize it the way that you could if you were on premises. So that's the main reason why I did not select that one as a correct answer in this case.
I do want to clarify really quickly for the people in the chat. Unfortunately, I'm doing one sticker for the first person to get it right, not for everyone. We have some sneaky folks trying to give the right answer after you've explained it.
I love it. Now, the good news is in the other study groups, we'll continue to give out more swag. So just stick around for the other study groups. You'll always have another opportunity. Don't worry if you don't get it today.
All right. I think we're kind of coming into the end of things. So, yay, perfect time for homework, right?
Absolutely. So if you go to the link for the meetup, which if you've RSVP'd for the meetup, and I really hate that I can't see my mouse. There we go. So if you've RSVP'd for the meetup, go ahead and scroll down to notes and additional dates about the exam info. Open up this link, and you'll see in the GitHub repo that it says schedule right here. So if you click on schedule, you'll see the dates for the next study group. So this is the one from today, the kickoff. The next one's going to be August 21st. We really wanted this to be a bi-weekly meeting. Unfortunately, we both had things going on, so we had to push it back to about 3 weeks. So we do apologize about that. But that gives you more time to get started and get ready for that next study group, where we're really going to cover getting started with AWS. And if I can give any advice, it would be to read up on the following key terms here: identity and access management, IAM users, IAM groups, IAM policies, and access keys. Those are all available with references in additional resources in that GitHub repo. So if you scroll down here, go to reading material to prepare for study group number 2. I already have included links to these different topics that I just mentioned. So just read through the documentation, get familiar with it. Don't worry about getting hung up on any key terms. If you don't understand it, just keep reading, try to familiarize with it as much as possible. And when we get to the next study group, we'll be able to cover that. The other thing I will say is if you do get stuck and you want to keep moving forward, and I'll come right back to this slide, we do have these community Slack channels where you can join and ask us questions. And these are also available. Let's see, where did you put them, Al?
Which ones are we looking for? Sorry.
The Slack links.
Oh, you know what? I will push that up. I will push that up to the About MD.
Okay, sorry, I thought you already had, but that's right. Awesome.
Call me out.
Oh, no, I did. Wow. I put it in here and I forgot I did. So yeah, you can click on these links, join the Slack channel, join study group, although I think it's without a dash, so I need to fix that. And we'll be able to answer questions there as well, even before the next meeting. So feel free to do that. Also, highly recommend downloading this presentation, which is available in that GitHub repo, and download the sample AWS exam questions and answer number 5 and 6. So if you go to this, the helpful resources, sample exam questions, open up this link. This is the official AWS sample questions. In this, you have 2 questions that you should be able to answer now. If you can't, don't worry, just ask us, we'll help you out. And those are going to be number 5 and number 6. Don't answer them right now. You can answer them later. Which of the following is AWS's responsibility under the AWS shared responsibility model? And then this one as well. So for next time, we'll go over the answers to those questions and also review the GitHub repo for any additional information. So that's going to be your homework between now and the next meetup. And I'm really excited that we're a part of this. And I'm really excited to see you next time as well.
All right, we're going to wrap up with one final question. And guys, if y'all want to put more questions in, we're meeting again, so we'll definitely address them then. But the last question that we have for you, Christoph, is, and you know what, if we want to come back on camera so people aren't just looking at the slide, is how transferable is the information that everyone is learning right now to another another distribution, another cloud. So if someone is learning this AWS information, how transferable will that knowledge be to, let's say, going to Google?
Great question. I would say it's fairly transferable. There are going to be certain key terms that are going to differ depending on what provider you're using. So AWS might call it IAM users. Google Cloud will call it something different, or they might call them edge locations. Google Cloud calls them something different. So the key terms will be different, but the concepts themselves are very transferable. And I get this question all the time. I love these questions. Thank you for the great questions. And that question is, do I focus on one cloud provider and then in the future go to other cloud providers, or do I try to learn all of them at the same time? My personal recommendation is get very familiar with one platform, especially if that's the platform your job uses, or you're just more interested in that one. Because if you go fairly deep in that platform, you'll be able to jump to the other platforms and you'll think, oh, wow, yeah, I've seen this before. I use this in AWS. They just call it different, something different, but it's essentially the same thing. And I can use it in very similar ways. They just have slightly different parameters or names or whatever it is. So I would recommend going a little bit deeper and then going wide, but to each their own. So if that's not what you want to do, you can always try it out the other way as well.
No, I think I would agree with you and actually maybe go a little stronger in pushing people to not try to be a jack of all trades right off the top. Like I said, I come from an OpenStack background, and as you're going through this, I'm going, wait, like, why are they calling it an NC2? We just called it an instance. Like, it's the same concept regardless of the cloud,
Yeah.
just with a different name. So I would agree with Christoph here, as everything that you learn here is going to be transferable throughout your tech career. I mean, when we're looking at EC2 instances, how much does that really differ from if we're talking virtual machines? Like, we can go down to the nitty gritty, but the concepts still transfer out.
Completely. Yep. Completely.
All right, guys. Well, thanks so much for joining us. You guys have a great 2 weeks. We are definitely still available through the Linux Academy Slack if you have any questions between now and then. I know that I will be in Las Vegas for Hacker Summer Camp, so anyone in that area, please feel free to stop by and say hi. And Christoph, I know that you'll be in a few places as well.
Yeah, we are going to a few conferences. I need to remember which ones I'm going to and when. I schedule, but I'm also on LinkedIn. So if you want to look me up, Christoph Limpeler on LinkedIn. I love connecting with people. I love helping answering questions. So join the Slack. I'll be there as well. LinkedIn, I'm very active on that as well. So please feel free to connect. And thank you so much for spending time with us today. Looking forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks so much. And you guys can find me on Twitter at L_O_punk. Christoph, what was
Hello,
your
Punk.
Twitter? Hello, Punk.
Christoph Limpeler, something like that. I don't use Twitter as much, but I'm still there if you want to follow. So feel free.
All right, guys. Have a great day. And thank you all for joining us on your lunch break. Bye.
See you later.